1, Joanne Lamont.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Indeed, to ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of this International Women's Day.
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, with your permission, I'd like to say just a few words about Paul McBride, who died tragically last weekend. Paul was an outstanding advocate, a very substantial public figure in Scotland. His reservoir of talent was great indeed. I believe he had a great deal more to contribute to the law and indeed to the great debate on Scotland's future. He will be sorely missed, and I am sure the whole Chamber will wish to convey our condolences as a Parliament to Paul's partner Gary, his parents and his many friends and colleagues. Presiding Officer, today, as was said, is International Women's Day, a day when the world celebrates the achievements and contributions of women past and present. Here in Scotland, I want to acknowledge the tremendous contribution made by women to Scottish society. So this is a fitting opportunity to announce that the Scottish Government have committed to fund the Scottish Resource Centre for Women in Science, Engineering and Technology at Napier University. Funding for the UK parent body had been removed by Westminster. The facility faced closure. We have acted now to ensure that this centre, which supports the success of women in fields of endeavour where they are significantly underrepresented, remains open to continue its vital work.
And may I, on behalf of the Labour benches, add our support and sympathy on the very sad and tragic loss of Paul McBride, both to his family and, of course, to the important and critical debates within Scotland itself. And, as the First Minister says, he will be sadly lost. Presiding Officer, John McAlpine, the First Minister's parliamentary aide, this week likened Scotland's place within the United Kingdom to that of a woman in an abusive marriage. Does the First Minister agree?
First Minister.
Well, no, she didn't. The Labour Party, feeling the need to misrepresent, really shouldn't treat hugely important issues in this fashion. Yeah. John McAlpine talked about the abuse of power. It's what she talked about in her column. I think there are abuses of power in terms of Westminster Government over Scotland. And I think if the Labour Party should try to treat the hugely important issue of abuse against women with the importance it deserves and not feel the desperate need to misrepresent what other people say.
Joanne Lamont.
I think the First Minister to be very careful about suggesting that people on this side wish to diminish the issue of domestic abuse and violence in the home. The reality is, across this Parliament, there has been a commitment and cooperation to address these questions, which is precisely why I think the First Minister should reflect on what his aide said. And it is for the First Minister to handle his aide. It is entirely a matter for him. But I don't know many people who have come out of an abusive marriage, entered into a social union and kept the same bank account as the First Minister suggests for a separate Scotland. The reality is, and he needs to deal with this, his aide's analogies are as offensive to women as his policies are damaging. Policies which put 400 women out of work every day. It's not been part of the United Kingdom, as his aide alleges, which is holding women back. We have Tory cuts compounded by the First Minister's inaction. That is why female unemployment is higher in Scotland than the rest of the United Kingdom. When is he going to start doing something to help women back to work? Or, like everything else, do we have to wait his 1,000 days for a referendum before he lifts a finger?
What I was pointing out to Joanne Lamont was that a hugely important issue shouldn't be demeaned by taking somebody's remarks totally out of context and totally distorted. There are plenty of abuses of power of Westminster over Scotland. I would regard the Remploy employees today, for example, suffering from an abuse of Westminster power. I would regard the cuts to the disability living allowance in Scotland as a huge abuse of power. And I would regard the plans to replace the Trident missiles in the Clyde as an enormous abuse of power which should be sorted out in Scotland. Now, in terms of the seriousness of the issue as we have challenged and taken it as a Parliament, I am sure Joanne Lamont would be the first to acknowledge that against the extraordinary difficult circumstances of Westminster cuts that were told by Alistair Darling to be deeper and tougher than those of Margaret Thatcher, The fact that the investment in key areas in Scotland has not been just maintained but increased against this background is a huge tribute to the commitment that we as a government and we as a parliament. For example, funding for violence against women, including domestic abuse, has doubled. Funding has increased from £21 million over 3 years to £55 million in the 4 years 2008 to 2012. Now, against that background of cuts imposed from Westminster, surely these figures indicate this government's endeavour, our joint endeavour, to give these hugely important issues the priority they deserve.
I already acknowledge there is a commitment across the Parliament on domestic abuse, and I recognise the funding for that. I hear from the First Minister a critique of what the Tories in Westminster have done, who, by the way, are a problem because they are Tories, not because they are English. I hear nothing about his responsibilities. The point I was making was that women's female unemployment is higher in Scotland than it is in the rest of the United Kingdom. That is his responsibility. The Deputy First Minister, of course, has also been making grand promises this week. Apparently, it is only in an independent Scotland that we can have policies that don't offend our sense of decency. Yet, on her government's watch, fuel poverty is double what it is in England. She does nothing. Childcare costs are higher in the United Kingdom, and she does nothing. 1 in 4 children live in poverty, and she does nothing. Isn't this the Manana government doing nothing for people in difficulty today, promising them the world tomorrow, a tomorrow that is at least 1,000 days away?
First Minister.
Can I point out that the reason a Tory government rules over key areas of Scottish life is precisely because the Labour Party have accepted the position of Westminster control over vital areas of Scotland. Now, there is a huge difficulty in unemployment at the present moment across the sectors of society, affecting women, affecting young people, of course. But I think Joanne Lamont should at least recognise that the employment rate, the number of people in jobs, and there are 10,000 more women employed in Scotland than there were just over a year ago, 10,000 more, but the number of women in jobs is the highest across these islands. The employment rate in Scotland for women is higher than England, higher than Wales, higher than Northern Ireland. That is something that should be acknowledged. And in terms of issues as we move forward, I think I have already said to Joanne Lamont the importance that I stress and give to the figures we are seeing from modern apprenticeships. Remember the modern apprenticeships that the Labour Party voted against in the budget debate, that has moved from 27% of young women participating in modern apprenticeships when they were at a disgracefully low level of 15,000 or 16,000 to 45% participating in modern apprenticeships now at the much increased level of 25,000. So I hope that as a Parliament we can unite to look at that 25,000 modern apprenticeships, not just for this year but stretching through the next 5 years, and see that percentage of young women going in to learn trades and skills ever increasing as a contribution to our acknowledgement as a Parliament of the critical role of women in working and Scottish society.
Joanne Lamont.
You see, if the First Minister was talking to women, he would know his figures on employment for women is masking something much more serious. We have lost over 100,000 full-time jobs to temporary and part-time jobs. Women in local government, which you have targeted for cuts, and in the voluntary sector, are having their hours cut. The figures are masking the fact that women disproportionately are suffering unemployment and underemployment. But the gap between the words and the reality grows as we speak. Last week, the First Minister told us that the only thing Rupert Murdoch got when he visited him was a cup of tea and a caramel wafer. Now we found out he also offered Murdoch a multi-million-pound tax cut. And of course, there's a pattern here. If you're a working person,
We will hear the member, please.
If you're a working person who needs help,
Order.
all you get from the First Minister are warm words about what might happen in 1,000 days. But if you're Fred Goodwin, you get all the backing the First Minister can muster. If you're Donald Trump, you get direct access to the Chief Planning Officer. And if you're Rupert Murdoch, you get offers of £1 million tax cuts in exchange for headlines. Some might say, First Minister, Scotland bought and sold for Murdoch gold. Isn't it about time? Isn't it about time? Isn't it about time that we heard, and women heard, and families across this country heard less about his fantasies for tomorrow and more about how he will deal with the realities of today?
First Minister.
I think that law would indicate that Joanne Lamont would be better to focus on one subject at a time in these question times. Let's look at the issues, the substantive issues. Well,
order. We'll hear the First Minister. Order.
Better asking questions badly on one subject than asking them badly on 6 subjects, in my opinion. So let me give Joanne Lamont the statistics. Accepting, of course, unemployment is far too high. There's 10,000 more women in work than there was just over a year ago. The figure for employment, people actually in jobs, which really is a very important figure, is 66.8% in Scotland, is 65.3% in England. The number of young women not just starting modern apprenticeships at 45%, but can also tell her in training for work statistics. It's gone up from 28% 3 years ago to 35% now. There is still more work to do, but again it indicates that young women taking their rightful place in the workforce. In terms of positive destinations, that's young women leaving school, going on to the positive destinations of full-time education, employment and training. It's now 90.4%, an increase from 87.8% in 2006-2007. The commitment of this government to no compulsory redundancies in our controlled public sector and the health service is vital for all workers, but it seems to me particularly vital for women, given the importance they play in the public sector workforce. And finally, of course, the delivery, not the commitment, not the promise, but the delivery by this government of something the Labour government never did, and that's the living wage at £7.23 an hour across our controlled public sector. That is why, when it came to the test last year, not just a vast majority of Scottish men, but a substantial majority of Scottish women gave this government their endorsement and placed their hopes in this government for improving the lot of women and Scottish society by getting control over the towering heights of this economy so as we can mould a better future free of Tory government.
Question number 2, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'd like to thank the First Minister for his warm words regarding Paul McBride. Paul made a huge contribution to Scottish public life, and he had many friends across this chamber, and the thoughts of the Conservative Party are with his partner and family at this time. I'd like to ask the First Minister when he will next meet the Prime Minister.
First Minister. No plans in the immediate future.
Ruth Davidson.
Today, the Scottish Conservatives have announced plans to support the government's minimum pricing for alcohol bill in return for concessions which will help industry, voluntary notification to Europe and, vitally, a sunset clause so that while we hope this measure works in reducing the problem of drinking across Scotland, Scottish industry is not penalised in perpetuity should it not prove effective. Yesterday, the Scottish Conservatives tried to help employers by blocking the retail levy, a Scotland-only tax designed as a £95 million cash grab by the Cabinet Secretary to plug holes in his budget, aided and abetted by Labour. Unheralded in the SNP manifesto, and with no assessment to check its impact on Scottish retailers, this punitive tax will result in Scottish retailers having the highest business poundage for more than 20 years. Already Asda has said that this uncompetitive tax will add a significant cost to their business in Scotland and have warned that future projects may now be scrapped. Can I ask the First Minister, can he tell me how many young people right now are employed by the retail sector in Scotland?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, can I say to Ruth Davidson that I welcome the Conservative Party's change in position on minimum pricing. It was indeed a matter which was touched on in the discussions I had recently on the Constitution with the Prime Minister, and I hope that since we've seen since the election both the Liberal Democrats and now the Conservatives see the importance, the crucial nature of Scotland confronting its difficulties with alcohol and seeing this legislation as worth trying to see if we can combat the scourge on society. And I welcome the movement in both the Liberal Democrats and now the Conservatives to try and make this a success as a Parliament. I don't agree with her in terms of the impact she feels that the retail levy will have. As she mentioned, announced plans for 3 new stores and a replacement depot in Scotland on the 23rd of January, in full knowledge of the Government's plans for the retail levy. But Ruth Davidson, if she wants to say that we don't need to make this move in order to fund the critically important areas of public spending, areas incidentally which Ruth Davidson calls for additional public spending, and oblivious to the fact that the pressure on our budget comes from her own colleagues at Westminster, then perhaps she will detail for us here and now where she would see and what she would cut or where she would raise the money, as opposed to having this completely proportionate levy which allows a vital contribution in terms of health education, in terms of the general confronting of the problems with alcohol. I'm not going to say better one sinner repentive, because I want to treat this matter in terms of well, I was only saying it so as I didn't say it, can I say to Mr McCletchie? So I withdraw saying it, if that helps. if that helps. But I do want to see us treat this vitally important matter of taking the initiative, having the courage to introduce minimum pricing as part of an overall and general approach to confronting the scourge and evil of Scotland's problem with alcohol.
Ruth Davidson.
Well, I think the retail levy has no health preventative properties. It doesn't target retailers selling alcohol and tobacco, merely the largest in the field. It's not proportional cost to the amount of alcohol or tobacco sold, and calling it a health levy, frankly, is a fig leaf to the embarrassment of the Finance Secretary, whose numbers didn't add up. The First Minister did not answer my question regarding youth employment, so I will answer it for him. More than a third of all Scots working in retail are under the age of 25. It supports 80,000 young people directly and is a gateway to employment in other industries for thousands more. 62% of all retail jobs are done by women. CBI Scotland, the Scottish Property Federation, the Scottish Retail Consortium, the Shop Workers Union USDO, the Scottish Chambers of Commerce, the Scottish Council for Development and Industry, the Wine and Spirit Trade Association, the British Council for Shopping Centres all condemn this tax as damaging to Scotland. The First Minister says he wants to be trusted with all of Scotland's taxes, and we see now what he would do with them. He would put them up. He would damage the very companies who are preventing Scotland's youth unemployment figures from rising above the already scandalous 102,000 young people on the dole. So it's not too late, First Minister. Will he now scrap this cynical, anti-competitive £95 million tax that will endanger jobs and investment in Scotland?
First Minister.
Well, can I, as gently as possible, remind Ruth Davidson that the application of a 2.5% increase in VAT was 10 times the impact of the retail levy. But not only that, the application of VAT applied to goods and services and companies across the board. Yes. This retail, the public health supplement, and in that title is the clue to what's being done with the revenue, applies to 0.1% of retail outlets in Scotland, and business rates which currently account for 2% of their turnover after the supplement will go to an estimated 2.3% of turnover. So a party which swept VAT into the Scottish economy a year ago, oblivious to the minor impact on a small number of very large retails of a public health levy which will help finance critical areas of preventative spend in Scotland. And finally, I can say to Ruth Davidson, after the publishing of the GERS figures yesterday, if we had access to the £2.6 billion lost to the Westminster Treasury in last year's accounts, £509 for every man, woman and child in Scotland, then we'd have a range of choices open to us which are not open under Tory rule from Westminster.
Patricia Ferguson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister is aware of the decision by the UK Government to close 4 Remploy factories in Scotland, including one in Springburn. The First Minister will, I am sure, share my concern about the way this announcement has been made and about the situation these workers are being placed in. Can the First Minister indicate what actions his government will take to support Remploy workers in Scotland? Can he advise the Chamber if he will encourage the increased use of Section 19 provisions in government procurement, and confirm whether or not his government responded formally to the consultation on the SACE report, and if not, what action it took to influence the outcome of it?
First Minister.
We have been in discussion on that very matter, and it made it all the more disappointing that the first notification we got of the decision on Remploy was yesterday afternoon, when Fergus Ewing spoke with Maria Miller, who told him what the announcement was to be. It is of great disappointment, not only the decision, but the manner in which the decision was communicated, given the amount of discussion there had been upon the general issue. The member touched on what I think is a very important issue in terms of Article 19. In October 2010, Public Contract Scotland portal developed a re-registration process to identify supported businesses for buyers. That work is ongoing, but it has had some substantial effect, and I can say to the Chamber, since October 2010, a total of 9 contracts or framework agreements have been awarded to supported businesses to the value of £13.7 million. And the latest financial data, which we now have in this key area, confirms that £24 million was spent with Scottish-based supported business by the Scottish public sector for the last financial year. I share the member's great disappointment and great concern. I think the announcement at very best was ill-timed and insensitive. The preparations that are necessary do not seem to have been done about how the 104 disabled people, the total 111 jobs in Scotland, will be guided into productive employment. And these discussions must start as quickly as possible, and the UK Government must accept its responsibility for the situation in which it has placed so many vulnerable people.
Colin Keir.
Following the announcement by RBS that 120 jobs are being cut in my constituency, can I ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to ensure that employees who are made redundant are supported into new employment? And does he agree that at a time when RBS requires solid political leadership, the statements made by Vince Cable demonstrate why Scotland should be in charge of its own banking regulations?
First Minister.
The member is perfectly right to point out that it was actually, of course, a leaked letter rather than a statement. But if the Royal Bank of Scotland were to be broken up, then it would have substantial implications for the headquarters workforce in Scotland. And I regret that in Vince Cable's memo to the Prime Minister there was no acknowledgement of that important matter. I share the concern regarding job losses which have been announced by Royal Bank of Scotland, the impact this will have on employees affected and their families. And I am aware that, of course, Fergus Ewing has already responded to the member with full details of the support being provided through PACE and the Finance Sector Jobs Task Force. Can I say to the Chamber that the Finance Sector Jobs Task Force, which is part of, under the auspices of FISAB, the agreement between the financial sector and the Scottish Government, has had substantial success in allowing people who have been released by the clearing banks to find other financial sector employment. And over the last few years, that has been a substantial success. So I hope this goes some way to assure the member of what we are doing, and will do everything possible to minimise the time these individuals affected by redundancy are out of work.
Question number 3, Willie Rennie.
To ask the First Minister what issues will be discussed at the next meeting of the Cabinet.
First Minister.
Next meeting will discuss issues of importance to the people of Scotland.
Willie Rennie.
In the first edition of The Sun on Sunday, the First Minister played down the role in the phone hacking scandal of The Sun, the News of the World and News International. Using a defence, it wasn't just them, others did it too, the First Minister lent his support to Rupert Murdoch and yet was silent on the victims of phone hacking. Does the First Minister believe that hundreds of phone hacking victims and their families will be satisfied with his failure to stand up to News International?
First Minister.
I don't know if Willie Rennie managed to attend this chamber last week when I reiterated and made it absolutely clear of my full support for police investigations south and indeed north of the border, my full support for the Leveson inquiry. But I do think Willie Rennie should take on board the findings, since the then government did absolutely nothing about it, of Operation Motorman. I promised last week that would be placed in spice, just in case the identification by the Information Commissioner of potential criminality in terms of data protection hadn't been fully understood by this chamber. But he will find, if he looks at that list that extends across, particularly, that has to be said, the London press, there are very few Scottish examples in that analysis, but nonetheless every single part of that, in my view, should be analysed and looked at, as well as supporting the police inquiries into phone hacking and the Leveson inquiry to the hilt. I hope now that has been explained to Willie Rennie. He will now accept our total commitment to seeing the law is upheld.
Willie Rennie.
But he prefers to cosy up rather than stand up to Rupert Murdoch. Earlier this week, he was caught bragging about Rupert Murdoch's support for independence. And we've discovered that Rupert wants to break up Britain in revenge for the Leveson phone hacking inquiry. And our First Minister is only too happy to leap on that and ignore the victims. That was the trade, wasn't it? I'll scratch your
Let us hear the member, please.
You scratch mine. It's not the column in the Sun and Sunny that's the problem. It's not the fireside chats with Rupert. It's not even the free tickets to the golf. My problem is that rather than stand up to Rupert, he has defended him. He's put his interest above those of the victims. Is the First Minister not ashamed of this grubby deal?
First Minister.
Well, I think Willie Rennie would be well to look at what I said last week and to at least hear my answer to his first question before reading out his second question. It is totally unreasonable to make the point of upholding the police investigations in England and Scotland, upholding the Leveson inquiry, asking for the law to be enforced and upheld, which clearly was not done over recent years. That is a total commitment that this government has, and I do really suggest to Willie Rennie that he has a good look at the findings of Operation Motorman and the extent of potential criminality across the Fleet Street press and the number of titles which were named by the Information Commissioner in that report. As far as other remarks are concerned, I was going to start talking about Michael Brown and Liberal Democrat donors and how the Liberal Democrats are really in no position to quote to anyone about their associates. But I know that Liberal Democrats have always wanted to adopt a holier-than-thou policy across politics, the party which put the moan into sanctimony.
Question number 4, Kenneth Gibson.
To ask the First Minister what the implications are of the findings in the Scottish Government's recently published State of the Economy report.
First Minister.
Well, the State of the Economy report highlighted the challenge facing the global economy, the economic outlook for the months ahead. The Scottish Government has and continues to take decisive action to promote growth and create jobs, action which helps Scotland to face a recession, and it was both shorter and shallower, although extremely serious, than that for the UK as a whole, and that fact, of course, is confirmed by the report, as well as the extraordinary challenges that will face public spending for years to come if we remain under the thumb and control of the London Treasury.
Kenneth Gibson.
I thank the First Minister for his answer. Does he share my concern that UK Government cuts and revised inflation forecasts will cause the Scottish Government's spending power to fall in real terms by 18% over 7 years, meaning that the cumulative loss to the Scottish budget over this period could be £51 billion, £10,000 for every man, woman and child in Scotland? And does he agree that as government expenditure on Revenue Scotland figures revealed yesterday, an independent Scotland would be in a stronger fiscal position than the UK as a whole, have a lower per capita debt and therefore be better able to stimulate investment, generate growth, create jobs, raise living standards and improve the quality of life for everyone living in Scotland?
First Minister.
Yes, I agree.
First Minister, briefly, please.
Well, the figures published yesterday with the official kite mark, £2.6 billion. That's equivalent to £510 for every man, woman and child in Scotland. Facts are Cheels at Wanny Ding. The figures speak for themselves, and the anti-independence parties in this chamber better get used to hearing it, because they're going to hear a lot more of it.
Question number 5, Malcolm Chisholm.
To ask the First Minister whether the Scottish Government will issue guidance on the new public entertainment licensing regime.
First Minister.
Well, the Cabinet Secretary for Justice has written to licensing authorities this week. This will assist them and sets out the powers they have to decide what they wish to licence and what not to licence. Now, the amendment was introduced to allow local authorities to control and ensure safety at large-scale, free-to-enter events such as raves and firework displays. When they take licensing decisions, we expect them to take account of the impact on cultural activity and small-scale events in their areas, in order to continue to support the fantastic individual, grassroots and community-based artistic talent that we have in Scotland. That is the case at any time, but particularly important during the Year of Creative Scotland. I am pleased to note, since Malcolm Chisholm is asking the question, the Edinburgh Council have now indicated that no free cultural events for audiences of less than 200 people will be affected.
Malcolm Chisholm.
Well, can I thank the First Minister for, at long last, issuing a letter yesterday, so soon after my question appeared on the order paper. But can I tell him that last week I spoke to a constituency meeting of more than 200 people who were very concerned about the threat to grassroots culture and very annoyed about both the new licensing legislation and the absence of any guidance about it. Given that the Scottish Government didn't understand the immediate implications of its own legislation when questioned about it at stage 1, will it now take every action possible to promote and support our vibrant grassroots culture in this Year of Creative Scotland?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, let me congratulate Malcolm Chisholm on his question and eliciting the response I am about to give him. Can I gently point out that it can't really have been a legislative problem, otherwise it wouldn't be possible for a letter of guidance to sort that problem. Of course, as he was well aware, local authorities under the legislation had the discretion which they are now using. But I'll be the last person, incidentally, and I hope he does welcome the letter that's gone out from Kenny McCaskill, which seems an excellent letter of guidance to local authorities. But I would be the very last person to say that independent-minded members of this chamber can't have a key role in asking key questions in public concern, and I congratulate him on doing it.
Question number 6, Murdo Fraser.
Thank you. To ask the First Minister what action has been taken to prevent those not actively farming from being able to claim agricultural subsidies.
First Minister.
It is totally unacceptable that speculators are using a loophole in the legislation to claim single farm payment while doing nothing in return. We are making sure this loophole is closed in the Common Agricultural Policy reform negotiations that are currently underway, the so-called Scottish Clause. The position, however, is not as simple as using the existing legislation on the definition of active farmer, because the independent analysis into this matter identified that if we had tried to use the current legislation, then we would have ended up not just closing the loophole, but depriving a range of very active farmers, particularly crofters, of key matters of their livelihood.
Can I thank the First Minister for his response? According to the BBC documentary The Money Farmers broadcast earlier this week, there are millions being spent every year on subsidies going to individuals who are not farming in Scotland. The European Commissioner for Agriculture was quoted on that programme saying the Scottish Government did have the power to change this loophole 2 years ago, but did not do so. So will the Scottish Government now act with urgency, working, if necessary, with the UK Government and the European Commission to ensure that the current unacceptable position is changed without further delay?
First Minister.
Well, I thought I'd kind of explained that, but the problem with using the active farmer definition, as suggested by the EU Commissioner, is in Scottish circumstances that would almost certainly penalise many crofting interests. And I am sure that Murdo Fraser, whose support for for the farmers of Scotland extends from the large farmers, I'm sure, right down to the small farmers and the crofters, since they have always been such a preoccupation of the Conservative Party through the years, would not want a situation where, in trying to close a loophole under existing legislation, we ended up disadvantaging a vital and traditional source of impact on farming and land tenure in rural Scotland. I'm sure he wouldn't have wanted us to do that. Now, the crofting situation may not be immediately familiar to many people across the European continent, but it should be familiar to people in this chamber. The loophole is being closed in terms of the new European guidelines, the so-called Scottish clause, which we have argued for with the support of the UK Government, who face a similar but not as proportionate circumstance south of the border, which will allow this loophole to be closed without disadvantaging the crofting community of Scotland. And when that happens, and it can't happen soon enough as far as we are concerned, then Murdo Fraser, myself and the rest of this chamber will be able to unite in closing a loophole without putting the crofters at a disadvantage.